Hello, my name's Jonathan Clark. Welcome to the fourth video in my audio recording tutorial series. This video is about multi-track recording in layers, and I'm going to put a link to the bottom of the YouTube screen right now back to tutorial video number 3. The reason for that is because this video actually originally turned out to be a little bit too big for YouTube, so I had to break it into two pieces. So this part 4 is actually a continuation of part 3. So if you haven't watched part 3, you might want to go back and watch that first. So this video makes a little bit more sense. But if you want to just try and push on from here, basically what I've done so far is I've recorded a song where I've played 4 instruments, piano, strings on keyboard, bass on keyboard, and an acoustic guitar. Created a session in Adobe's Audition audio editing software with all those tracks, and we're just about to go in and start going through the whole process of editing the session and coming up with a final mixdown. Okay, so we'll get right into things, and what I'm going to do here is I'll play about 20 seconds of the project with all the different audio tracks playing together so you get a sense of where we stand, and then we'll get right into editing. Okay, that sounds alright. Certainly not perfect, but with a little bit of editing we can definitely make some improvements. So basically what I'm going to do over the next half hour or so here is try and edit this as quickly as possible. It's not going to be a perfect job. A couple principles. One, first of all, don't assume that you can use your computer to fix all the problems. If you want a really good quality product in the end, start with better stuff on the input side. Start with better raw materials. And that means, number 1, making sure your equipment works. Number 2, making sure you've got good quality chords. You know, if you've got a bad chord that kind of like crackles and stuff when you move it, that's a bad thing. Get rid of it, get another one. Number 3, make sure your levels are right. You don't want things to be too loud coming in because of the possibility of distortion. But you also don't want them to be too quiet, because you've got 0 decibels, you've got absolute silence, and above that level there's a faint hissing, or it's called noise, background noise, and that might only be at, I don't know, whatever, a few decibels. If you've got a nice quiet room, you've got good quiet equipment, everything is grounded properly, whatever, and then above that you've got the instrument that you're recording. Now, if your noise floor is at, say, 10 decibels, and your instrument is being recorded at 30 decibels, I'm talking about like absolute noise out in the room, then you've only got a 20 decibel difference between your instrument and your noise floor. But if you've got something that you're recording at 60 decibels, then you've got a 50 decibel difference between the two. So that makes a big difference. Your noise, relatively speaking, is quieter in the background. Now, I shouldn't really use absolute numbers like that, because in a recording situation, looking at your DAW, remember what it does is it starts at a top value of 0 decibels and then goes down into negative numbers. So basically, let's say that your noise floor, instead of an absolute number, it's at something like minus 80. Okay, that means 80 decibels below your target top level without distortion is where your noise floor sits. And your recording levels of various instruments, you probably want them around, say, negative 15 to negative 10. So there's still lots of space above that before you get up to the point where you might start distorting or clipping. That's called the headroom. So you optimally, even though your final project, your final track that you produce, that you share with the world, the MP3 or whatever, hopefully that will be boosted up so it's only a few decibels below the absolute maximum. That might peak at minus 2 decibels, but your raw materials that you're working with in the meantime should be at least negative 10. In this example, you can see that my strings are actually pretty quiet, perhaps too quiet. They're probably down around minus 25 decibels. So I should have recorded those a little bit louder, but that's okay. And the other tracks, you know, this is good levels. These are probably 8, 10, 12 decibels below normal. Okay, so anyway, I forget what I was saying, but the noise floor. Oh, you want the best quality signals coming in from your equipment to work with at the start, and that also applies to musicianship. So if you, it doesn't matter if you're doing the recording yourself, or if you've got friends that you're recording, or if you've got clients. Try to make sure that the musicians do the best job possible. Sure, you can probably cut up a bass track, rearrange notes, and do all sorts of stuff to fix all kinds of mistakes. I mean, ultimately, you could probably have a bass player play 8 different notes in a scale, one at a time, and then go home. And you could probably cut and paste and copy and rearrange and turn those into his entire bass line. But that's not going to sound great. The more editing you do, the less desirable the final end product will be. So if it's you recording yourself, you're always in a hurry to do a recording, but sometimes it's better to make sure you've got everything sort of set and you think you're ready to go, and then step back and say, I'm not going to do this for another 24 hours, and then spend a day practicing your parts over and over and over again so your musicianship is better. It gives you a better product in the end. Okay, so basically what we're going to do though is we are going to do some editing, and I'm going to try and minimize the amount of editing, but things that I'll do is I'll be changing the volumes, I'll be changing the panning, because remember most of these tracks are stereo, or mono. I'll be doing possibly some noise reduction, hopefully not in the piano, bass, or strings, because those were directly connected from the keyboard to the system, so there shouldn't be very much background noise there. The acoustic guitar was recorded with a microphone, so there may be some background room noise that we want to try and reduce, but we'll see. And we'll do a little bit of EQing, and we'll do a little bit of reverb. And the reason for all these different changes, like volume changes, that's because we want the relative levels of each instrument to work well together. Okay, so piano is kind of my central instrument on this track, and I want that to stand out. I want the strings to be very soft, and I want the acoustic guitar to be pretty soft in the background. The bass, it'll be a little bit louder, but it's in a very different register than the piano, so hopefully that won't distract from the piano too much. And that brings up a point. EQing, the point of EQing is, it sounds very odd, but most of these instruments, you will do EQing to them to make them sound very different in a mix than if they were sitting by themselves. Okay, so if I was playing just an acoustic guitar and nothing else, I would want that sound to be as full as possible and to be ringing throughout the entire frequency spectrum as much as possible. If I'm playing the guitar and I'm singing, my vocals will overlap the acoustic guitar notes in some parts of the audible frequency spectrum. And if I'm singing, the vocals usually are the focus of the song. So the vocals have to stand out more, and the acoustic guitar has to complement it. So let's say the pitch of the guitar mostly ranged from really low notes, like, I don't know, maybe 400 hertz up to, say, 1200 hertz. I don't know, as an example. And let's say my vocals, the low end of my vocals, were around 1000 hertz and go up higher. So there's that overlap from 1000 to 1200 hertz, where the guitar is quite audible, and I've also got vocals. So what I might do is EQ my guitar, so after 1000 hertz, there's a big drop off, and so all the low end of the guitar still comes through. That higher part that clashes with my vocals gets dropped down quite a bit, which means that my vocals are more audible. Okay, so I don't have to necessarily change the volume of the guitar or the volume of my voice. I have to use the EQing to kind of carve out a niche for each instrument. Think of the voice as an instrument. Okay, so my voice as an instrument gets the frequency niche gets the frequency range from 1,000 and on up. The guitar have to chop out some of its top end to make room for the vocals. Okay, so that's what it's called. You're carving out, well, that's what I call it. You're carving out parts of the frequency spectrum for different instruments to allow room for other instruments or vocals to have a space in the mix. And that's how you get a really successful mix. If you've got 3 or 4 instruments, you've got drums, bass, acoustic guitar, piano, and vocals, then each of those instruments by itself is going to sound very, maybe hollow, very empty compared to its original recording across the whole spectrum. Because what I might have is I might have, the bass gets a very narrow band down at the bottom. The acoustic guitar gets a narrow band in one area. The vocals get a narrow band in another area. And the piano kind of, jumps, who knows, it's got peaks and valleys maybe. But essentially the effect is it eliminates a lot of the muddiness where the instruments are working against each other, and it gives each instrument a spot in the mix. So you don't have to turn the volumes up, because realistically, when you start turning the volume up on one instrument to make it stand out, well, then you want to turn the volumes up on other instruments to make them balance. And it's a no-win situation. So the only way to really make stuff sound good in a mix is to get rid of a lot of it and just give it a much narrower EQ band. So when you solo that instrument, it's going to sound much emptier than it would if it was by itself. But that's what makes a mix work. Okay, so there's your EQ editing lesson. Reverb. Not much to say about reverb, except that it's often good to use the same type of reverb on each instrument in a mix to make it sound consistent. And it's also good to use the same amount to make it sound consistent. Like, you don't want to have a mix where you've got a tiny bit of reverb on the guitars and the vocals and stuff, and then the drums, when you hit the drum, it's got a massive, massive reverb. It just doesn't sound normal, because you don't get that in a real live performance. You don't hear small amounts of reverb from some of the band and more from the other. So consistency is good. Now, there are some other rules which I'll mention, but we're not going to get into today. There's different types of reverb. Like, there's plate reverb, there's spring reverb. You'll see things like convolution reverb effects, whatever. Slightly different ways of approaching reverb, and interestingly, some types of reverb are more suited to some instruments than others. Like, plate reverb might be good for certain things in a mix, and spring reverb might be good for different other types of things in the mix. Okay, so it's not always the case that consistency is the best approach, but most of the time consistency is good. And with reverb, don't overdo it. So many people put way too much reverb on. So I've talked about reverb, EQing, noise reduction, panning. What we're going to do, in addition to using the frequencies to give each instrument its own spot in the mix, we're also going to do some panning. So in general, the piano is going to be front and center because it's our main instrument, and it's also going to have some width. I mean, we've got it panned right through the whole stereo field, but it's going to be the only thing that I'm going to leave by itself in the center. Or I should say, I'll leave a space for it in the center. What we'll do with the other instruments is we'll pan the bass off a bit to the left of center. We'll pan the acoustic guitar quite a bit to the right, and we'll probably pan the strings quite a bit to the left, maybe. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. But it'll give the effect that when you're standing there listening, the piano is everywhere, and it's the only thing coming at you from the center because there's no other instruments there. And then your other three instruments are going to be panned off a little bit to the sides. So it'll give it a full sound. And then with volume, we've seen in here on each track, there's an option to raise or lower the volume relatively in the mix. And let's experiment with that. I'll play this for a second, and I will turn the strings and bass up quite a bit. Okay, so you can change the volume of the track as a whole, and you can do it in different ways. You can use that volume knob on the track. I could double click, go into this, I could highlight the whole thing, and I could change the amplification, a permanent destructive edit. Or, in addition to those two things, I can also use this volume line, and I can create points. Actually, let's create a point or two right here. So these are called breakpoints, and what I'm going to do I'm going to create a peak. Now watch what happens when we play this. Listen to the bass. Okay, I'll hit Control-Z a whole bunch of times to get rid of those. So basically we can use the automation lines to really adjust our volumes too. I'll use a combination of processing the whole track and then doing small, final touches with the automation line. Okay, let me talk briefly about destructive edits versus non-destructive edits. Depending which DAW, which software you're using, you can have destructive or non-destructive edits, or in some programs you can have either. What's the difference? With a destructive edit, you change the underlying audio file and you can't go back to the original. With a non-destructive edit, you can change your mind. You can do different stuff. Okay? So basically imagine this. Imagine that we're editing something and I go in to my bass track and I highlight it. Let's say I put a reverb effect on it, change it all, hit save, close the project, go home, come back the next day, open things up, and I find that I don't like the reverb that I put on it. Well, I'm out of luck because there's no such thing as taking reverb out of an audio track. Once it's there for good. EQing, maybe you can fix a change a little bit. Like if you dropped the trebles above 1,000 hertz yesterday, maybe you can raise them to get it back, but even that is not perfect by any means. It's not the sort of situation you want to be in. Okay, so a lot of these edits I'm going to do today are going to be destructive edits. Generally speaking, destructive edits, not what you want to do. You're probably better off 90% of the time in a non-destructive edit situation. So, how do you do a non-destructive edit? Well, imagine instead of going into the track and applying that reverb, and then the whole track has the reverb on it, what if you could have a temporary version of it? Okay, and there's these things called plugins. Plugins are like effects are plugins, basically. You can have a physical reverb unit. You could have a software application, an app, that applies reverb to your audio. Either way, what you can do is, it's called plugging it into the track, inserting it onto the track. And the word inserting it onto a track, comes from the fact that on audio mixers, you've usually got an insert slot that a 1/4 inch plug will plug into. And so you take a plug from your reverb unit, or whatever the plug-in is, and you just, boom, plug it into insert it onto the track. And so what happens is you're still working with your underlying audio, but as you play it in real time, that effect gets applied to the audio, and that effect, the wet signal, the affected signal, goes right out to your system, to your master track, to your speakers, whatever, okay? But it's doing it in real time. It's not actually changing the underlying audio track that you've got saved on the disc. So this is good. This is really good. That's quite often preferable. And we're not actually going to use inserts right now, but we are going to use destructive editing here. And because of that, I want to change my session to give myself a backup in case I come back to it a few days from now or a year from now and I don't like what I've done. I want to see what I had in my original audio files. I want to have that option. So how do I do that? Now, because I want to keep original copies of all my files, we're going to do some saving right now. Now, if I double click on this and I go into here, save as, is this saving this under a new name? And so the file, the left piano here in my session, does that, I'll have 2 copies of the file. I'll have the one that's in there right now called track1_011. But if I save this as backup left piano, which track is my session using? Is it using the new one, the piano, the backup piano, or is it still using this track 111 and backup piano is basically a copy that's been saved and isn't being used? That can be confusing. Okay, it's actually the changed version that the session is going to be working with. So I'm going to call this edited left piano, because see how it's changed it here? And up here in our file browser, it's edited left piano. So if I go to make further changes to this, let's say I do something absolutely radical here, and I drop the volume out like that. If I hit save now, it'll be the track called edited left piano on the drive that has the volume cut out. And the track 1_11, the original thing that we recorded, won't have that volume cut out. That's unchanged. Now the drawback, okay, let's put that back first of all. The drawback is when you go out into multi-track session, it's changed its name up here in the file browser, and this is actually a file called edited left piano that we're working with. But the problem is Audition doesn't change the name here. So what can you do? Well, we could change the name by right-clicking and renaming, but I don't see that option. Okay, I'm sure it's there, but you know, that's a problem. So we'll come back to that in a second. Okay, first of all, let's save all these. Edited right piano. Okay. File, save as, edited bass. Okay, so we've saved all these different things now. I am actually going to close the session, not going to make any changes. Let's go into our directory and see what we've got. Okay, so now you can see our folder where it's got all the old names for these things, and it's got all these things where I've called them edited, where the names have changed. And if you compare them, edited acoustic guitar.wave, 19,142 kilobytes, acoustic guitar 17.wave. See, there's a 3 kilobyte difference there. That makes me a little bit concerned and nervous until you start looking and realize that it's the same thing on every one. I don't know why there's a slight change in size, but that's kind of weird. But to double check, let's do this. We're going to start a new multi-track session. We're going to go into the same folder, Neil Young, that we used before. And I'm going to call this session AR03 edited. Okay, so now we have a session, but we don't have any tracks. Let's look and see what happened here. Okay, within my Neil Young folder, I've got 2 different folders. Tutorial, this is what we used at the start, and then edited, this is what I just created a moment ago, but nothing is in it yet. Okay, what I'm going to do to make this less confusing, I'm going to go out of this folder, and all these different things that we copied, these new tracks we created by saving copies, I'm going to drag those into the edited folder. Okay, so now I have 2 folders. I have the tutorial, which has all of our original tracks, and it has our session file from the original recording. And then I have this one, which has a session file, and it has all these tracks, but they're not in my session. Okay, so what I do is go to multi-track, insert files, and I find all of my edited copies. Okay, so now I have, oops, I did not insert my bass. I forgot something. Multi-track, insert files. Huh, that was kind of odd. Okay, so save session, Control S. So now what I'm working with, no matter what I do here for the next half hour, I'm not going to mess up my original copies. If I make changes, I come back tomorrow, I don't like what I've done, I've still got my untouched original recordings that I can play with. Okay, so let's rename these for convention. Acoustic guitar. Let's not name that. Strings. Bass. Now the reason I didn't name that is because we are going to do something with this piano. You'll notice when I recorded the piano, I went with 2 separate channels. I set the recording input on the 2 channels, one to be the left channel on the piano, one to be the right. So I ended up with 2 separate mono tracks, which eventually I'm going to turn into a stereo signal. With the strings, on purpose, I did something different. I left the input when I recorded to say default stereo, and because my left and right were hooked up to 1 and 2 inputs on the sound card, instead of recording 2 separate mono tracks, it recorded a single stereo track. Now, which is the better approach? Well, it depends on your session. With my piano, eventually I'm going to convert that into a single stereo track anyway. So why didn't I just record it as a stereo at the beginning? Well, because in some cases, it depends on your session. In many cases, it's easier if they're combined, because when I start doing all my EQing and my reverb and all that sort of stuff, instead of doing each step twice on two separate files, I'd rather just hit once and do it on the stereo file, and that way I know the same thing is happening to both sides of my piano signal at the same time. If I'm actually cutting and pasting notes and moving them around, then absolutely, almost positively imperative that you want to be working with your stereo signal. Because if you go and move a note in your left channel, well, the right note has to move to exactly the same time. All those cuts have to be perfectly the same. So why try to do it twice when you can just do it once? So in knowing this, is there any reason why I would even bother to have two mono tracks at the start? Well, it's possible. When you look at these two tracks, look at this little section right here on the right side and then on the left side, and look at this part here and compare it to the left here. It almost looks like our left side recording is a little bit quieter than the right side, and that's based on the relative sizes of the waveform, which represent the volume. So it's possible that our left side of the piano is quieter than the right. In this case, I'm not going to do anything about it because I think they're pretty close, but in some cases, some situations, it might be that you actually want to play with one of the two channels without affecting the other, and so sometimes it's easier to have those as two separate tracks first, then you can make changes to one side and then you combine them. That's not the case today, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pan my left piano all the way to the left, I'm going to pan my right piano all the way to the right, and I showed you this before. We're going to hold down Control, Command on Mac, and I'm going to click on both of these, so those two are highlighted. I'm going to go up to multi-track, I'm going to go bounce to new track, selected clips only, and you can see here in the middle I now have a new track which is stereo. Okay, I'm going to call that piano. I could call it stereo in the background. Sure, why not? And let's save this as piano, stereo piano. Okay, again, that, oh look, see there's rename. And why did that not do any, oh, it's over here. Stereo piano. Okay, that's better. And actually for consistency, we'll call the track stereo piano. The name of the track does not have to match the name of the audio file on the disc. Okay, that's important to remember. So now that we have a stereo piano signal, do we need the left and right piano? No. So you can go right click, go down to track, delete selected track. And same thing with the right. I'm going to get rid of that. Okay, that's good. So we have strings, we have bass, we have acoustic guitar, and we have piano. Can we move? Yes, I'm dragging and dropping the guitar so it's down at the bottom. So I'm going to do the same thing with the strings. Drag and drop them. Maybe I'm going to do the same thing. There we go. Okay, so basically I've got these in the order now where the most important elements are at the top of the screen. I do that by convention. So our piano is our main source, top track, and then bass is important, and then the strings and guitar are just kind of embellishments. In a session with a full band, I might do things similar. I might put all the drums at the top, and then the bass, and then the piano, guitars, all that sort of stuff, and then the singers at the very bottom. Not that the singers are not the most important part of the track. You know, placing them at the bottom doesn't mean they're the least important in that situation. It's more like what follows the rhythm. So the stuff I usually put at the top, the drum kit, everyone follows the lead of the drums as far as timing goes. And in this track, everyone follows, all the other tracks follow the piano. Alright, now let me backtrack for a second here. You're probably wondering, why did I go to all that effort to rename every track and start a new session? Why didn't I just go into my browser, click on the folder, hit Control-C, go to a new drive, Control-V for paste, make a copy of the entire folder, and then rename it and call it Friday Original AR03 Tutorial. Okay, and then I would just keep working with the folder here on the C drive that I've been working with, but I would know that I have a backup on another drive that I can always go into and grab original files from. Well, that often actually is the best solution, to do it that way. Just back up the entire folder, put it somewhere else. If you're working in a professional situation with a paying client, you may want to even go so far as to not only back up on another drive, you might want to, at the end of each day, upload your session files, zip the whole thing into a single file, zip all the folders together, and you may want to upload that backup to the cloud. And that way, when you're off-site, you know, maybe it's uploading when you go home, but at least when you're home, if something happens catastrophic, like there's lightning hits the studio and fries all the electronics in your computer and both copies on your drive die, someone breaks in, fire, theft, whatever, it doesn't matter, there's a copy off-site. So that's a good practice that you should get into, is backing up stuff. File management is really, really critical in studio situations, because so many files are generated when you're recording and when you're editing. Your folders get really confusing, and you have to be logical about how you store stuff, and you have to be smart and back stuff up all the time. Okay? So now we have a backup on our separate E drive, which is nice. But the reason I went through the effort of editing all this stuff is because when you're downloading these files, I want you to have a completely separate session and folder full of the edited stuff that you can compare against the stuff from the previous, from when we recorded stuff. Let's put the headphones on and get to work. Now, here's some problems. First of all, I work with a lot of different audio editors, and memorizing the commands is a little bit tricky, because most DAWs, you have, you know, literally hundreds of different commands that you can memorize. There's probably 20, 30 that are really critical ones that your workflow goes a whole lot faster if you can memorize those key presses. So like hitting the C key in some software brings up the slice tool, cut, C for cut. Unfortunately, in Audition, you need to hit R for razor. And so there's going to be times here while I'm editing where I'm going to be trying to instinctively hit the C key. Adobe Premiere, which is what I do my video editing in, and which I've been using very extensively for the last couple of weeks, uses the C key to bring up the slice tool, razor tool. And so that's bad. Adobe should really be standardizing these things. But anyway, so the tools that I'm going to be using all the time, which you won't be able to see because they're going to be key presses, I'm going to use the R tool to bring up the razor. Watch this. Okay, so now you can see razor, and I can use that to go click, 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 and slice up my track into a number of separate clips. Okay, I'm going to Control Z a couple times to undo that, because I don't want to do that just now. Second tool I'm going to be hitting all the time is V. V brings up the move tool, and so that's this little cross you can see. And basically, if I have the move tool, I can hold down a button on the mouse and move left or right and move it looks like the entire track back and forth. Actually, what it is the clip that you have highlighted. So it just so happens that right now my entire track is one clip. Third tool that I'm going to use sometimes is the T tool, and that brings up this one. And this one's an interesting tool because if you click and drag and let go, it highlights a section. It's the time tool, T. So I use that fairly often. Control Z, so R and V and occasionally T is what I'll be using. 0 to go back to multi-track. Control A highlights everything. Control S saves everything. And that's probably Command A and Command S on the Mac. Okay, let's get right into it here. First thing I want to do is I want to balance my volumes a little bit. Now, within the system, there's 3 volumes to worry about. There's the volume of the underlying track. My bass track is a little bit quiet here. You can see most of the peaks are between -12 and -15. I'm going to double click, which also highlights all, same as Control A. Effects, Amplitude, Amplify. You can see this is a mono track, so there's only one gain slider. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up 4 decibels, apply. Okay, just give me a tiny bit more volume, and I'm going to hit Control S to save this track and go back into multi-track. Same thing with strings. I'm going to double click, and I'm going to actually make sure too that I've got the entire track, not just part of the track. See, watch this. If I double click now to highlight all, and I move my slider out, you can see I haven't actually highlighted all. So make sure if you're doing something to the whole track, you actually have the whole track highlighted. That's a little, it can be a mess if I change the volume on everything up to here and don't realize I didn't change it on the back half of the track, and later I have to try and fix it. Okay, so let's change the volume on this one, bump it up a little bit also. It's hard to tell what level most of this stuff is at. It's around -18. Let's put it up, say 6 decibels in each. And actually, see how my right track, I mentioned this on the piano earlier, it feels to me like the right track is a tiny bit louder coming out of the keyboard, and I'm not sure why, but just based on looking at the waveforms, it looks a little stronger. So what I'm going to do is bump up the left side just an extra decibel, and maybe that'll balance it out. I mean, it's hard to tell just from visuals, but let's hope that's right. So I'm going to hit save, go back into multi-track, and now I have things, so they're a little louder, easier to work with here. So I just changed the underlying volumes of 2 tracks. They are now permanently saved on the disk at that volume. But within my editor, I can also use my track volumes here, and that will raise or lower the volume as the underlying audio is playing back. So we've got a couple definitions we've got to work with here. We have the file, so this edited strings is saved on the hard drive as a single file. Okay, track or channel, depending which editor you're using, refers to this strip. So it's the strings track, and there is a strings, there's a file on the strings track called edited strings. So the file has its natural volume, the way it's saved at the disk. The track currently is set at +0, which means there's no changes to the volume of the file that's playing, but I can bump that up or down if I wanted. I'm not going to at the moment. In addition, we have the volume automation, so I can go up and down with that. And what I'm going to do in this session is most of these tracks, I'm going to have the track at a certain volume. I'm not going to be playing with the volume automation very much in each of these, but I might play with it a bit with some of the notes where I'm cutting them off and I want a note to fade away faster than it actually faded away when I played on the piano. Now, as far as panning goes, let's do some rough panning before we get into editing. because it'll make our instruments stand out a little bit better when I'm playing two instruments at the same time if they're not panned to the same position. Now, I already said the piano is not changing. It's currently set at 0 for the track pan. So basically what it's doing is going off the underlying volume of the file. And remember, the stereo piano file on the disc is actually panned, so the left side is 100% left, right side's 100% right. I'm going to leave that one there. The bass is panned to the center on the underlying file on the hard drive, but I'm going to adjust it and move it over to, say, let's start with 13.2% left. Let's see what that sounds like. Okay, I'm going to leave it there, just around 8.7% left. Bass guitar, usually I'll have panned fairly close to the center. And I turned up the bass temporarily with the track volume adjustment to make it more audible. Let's see what happens with the strings and the guitar. Okay, strings off to the left quite a bit. So now the bass is to the left a bit, strings much to the left. So for balance, we'll move the acoustic guitar quite a bit to the right. Now it doesn't sound quite balanced because right now there's more volume in the left side because I've got my bass up, my strings are louder than they're going to be in the end. I'm going to play with those. Ultimately, not only do you want things spread out through the stereo field, but you also want the approximate volume of the left half and the right half to be the same, be similar. So I'll have to play with things a little bit more eventually, but I think that's a good starting position. Now as I start to edit, I'm going to mute the strings and the acoustic guitar because I want to start by fixing the bass. The bass is the biggest problem right now. It's the one that is farthest away from being a correct tempo that matches our grid. Now you're probably wondering what the grid is. You can't see the grid here. There is no grid because I played the piano freeform. But if you can imagine the tempo of the piano as being the grid that we want to attach to, it's an audio grid, you can only hear it. And the problem is it's not a consistent grid. Because the piano's freeform, speeding up and slowing down, it's a little bit harder to match those notes. Now, sometimes I would be playing with an actual evenly spaced grid. If I was using a metronome, then we'd have those audio signals repeating at a consistent time interval, and that would give us an abstract audio grid to work with. And so if the metronome was actually turned on in the music, I wouldn't even have to have the piano turned on. I could mute the piano and I could go through the bass track and cut and slice and move bits of the bass track around so that every note fell in time with the metronome. And then I could turn that off and I could do the strings track by itself to the metronome and I could do the guitar track to the metronome. And because every track I'd be editing to that same backbone of the click of the metronome, the grid, everything would line up. But since I don't have that metronome, what I'm going to have to do is turn the piano on and the bass together, and then I'll have to slide notes around on the bass to make them match the piano instead of matching a nice grid. Sometimes you can actually have a real grid that you can see on screen. When you're working with a lot of type of MIDI music, not all, but most, if you're doing sort of electronica-based music where you've got a consistent steady beat, then you probably have a visible real grid turned on, so you can even see the divisions. You wouldn't even have to hear a metronome because you could see where the beat lands at the beginning of each bar and stuff like that. Okay, so we'll get into that when we get into MIDI in a couple more videos. So I'm going to start here with the bass track. I'm going to zoom in quite a bit, and essentially what I'm going to be doing with a lot of this is I'm going to be cutting and pasting. Like, okay, I can turn on my razor, I can cut, and then I can move a section. Okay, so I'll hit Control Z to put it back to where I left it. You'll want to have Control Z or Command Z undo. You want to have your fingers on them all the time when you're editing, because so often you'll make a little change and it's not right, and it's easy to be constantly hitting Control Z to make, to go back one step to fix something that you just did by mistake. So okay, I can move that piece. Okay, that doesn't help us, so I'll Control Z to put it back, and I'll Control Z a couple more times to get rid of those razor cuts. But that's essentially what I'm going to do here, is I'm going to try and go through this as fast as I can. It'll be a slightly rough job, but I'm going to do a lot of cutting on either side of a note when the note doesn't hit the right timing, and I'm going to slide it back and forth so it is in time with the piano. So let's zoom in a little bit more. Okay, I didn't like that. That's too fast. Why is that not? Oh, interesting. Okay, sorry, just experimenting here. Okay, I don't know if you can see that, but see how it gets a little bit thicker right here? It's coming along, a little tiny bit of waveform data, and then boom, a little bit thicker right there. I can assume that right there is where that beat hits. And so in a vertical line, the point of this should be over here a little bit more. So let's razor, razor, razor. And the next thing I'm going to do is, when I've got my move tool on, see how sometimes if I'm right on a cut, it will show a red pitchforky sort of tool, and it'll face either to the left, which means I'm actually on the right side of this clip when it's looking like this, or it'll face to the right, which is when I'm on the left side of this clip. Okay, and if I've got that tool, I can click on my mouse, move to the right, and drag and shorten the clip. So let's do the same thing right here. That's giving us some more room to work with. Now I can move stuff around, and I see it looks a little bit thicker right there, so I think if I move that there, and I want the front of my bass clip over here a bit, I bet you that's going to sound better with timing. Oh, that's good. That worked out really well. Okay, that worked out quite well. Sounds good. Now, a couple things that I want to do is this yellow automation line. If I actually click on that, it puts a breakpoint, automation breakpoint. I'm going to Control Z that. I don't want to do that yet, but that can be a problem. And I may also, it's hard to see, but there's a okay, you can see it up in this one. See this blue line? That is an automation line for my panning. I'm not going to be doing any panning as the track progresses. Once I've got my pan set, each instrument is going to stay in that space within my stereo field for the entire song. It's if you're recording a group in the studio, they're probably not walking around and they're playing. It's natural for each thing to have its own spot and stay there. Now, in some types of, especially electronic music, you'll find instruments, synths and stuff, that pan around very frequently, and that's natural, but you wouldn't get that kind of sound in an acoustical song like this. So to make sure I don't actually hit the pan envelope, that blue line, watch this, I'm going to turn it off. Okay, so now I don't have to run the risk of bumping into that, and you know, less cluttered is good. But I am going to leave my yellow automation lines on, my volume automation line on, because I might be playing with that shortly. I'm going to turn mute on here for a second. Oh, sorry, solo. I'm going to solo the bass line and listen to how it sounds. It sounds kind of punchy, choppy. Bum, bum, bum. That's because where I cut out pieces, even though this line looks very thin, there is some bass playing there. Is it possible to hear it? Well, maybe. Let's highlight this section. We'll turn loop on and we'll press play. No, that's actually quite faint. Okay, that's good. That's probably why it doesn't sound too bad. However, if I were to cut this out, let's try playing this. See, that sounds very choppy. That's no good. Sometimes it's nice to put a couple breakpoints in and do this. And this will fade that note out. Actually, let's highlight that and put it on repeat and see what it sounds like. Okay, and without that fade, well, it's got a natural fade built into it. Let's try if we do this. And again, giving it a bit of a fade this way. That certainly sounds more natural because you don't have that sudden absence of sound on that click. Okay, so there's going to be some times here when I'm playing with this over the next little bit that I am highlighting this line and I'll do a quick fade out to make the note sound more natural. See, you still get the clicks there. If I fade the volume very quickly to 0 at the end, I may not have that click. Okay, that's good. The reason I'm not getting a click when I fade the volume to 0, there's this thing called a zero crossing. With a sound waveform, you can see how there's waveform on either side of the center line, and that's because the waveform is actually a wave that jumps back and forth, oscillates constantly, very quickly. And if you have a point where you cut the end of a clip off, let's say that the waveform for some reason does a loop up here, goes down, and comes back up. So it's kind of a nice repeating pattern, like a sine wave is what it's called. If you have the end of your clip and you trim it, and the sine wave, where it goes off the end of the clip, if that sine wave is not at the center, say it's up at the high point, you get a click. If you do it where the sine wave is touching the center and you trim the clip to that point, you don't get a click. That is called the zero crossing, where it crosses the middle point, the 0 point. It's a weird little phenomenon, but you can actually set your software, because remember, this is happening literally thousands and thousands of times per second, back and forth and back and forth. So when I do a trim of my clip, it is going to, you know, what looks like a very small distance to me, like say maybe 30 milliseconds, if I trim just a tiny bit of that clip, during those 30 milliseconds, my wave can be going up and down past the 0 line hundreds or thousands of times. And you can actually set almost every DAW so that it's called snapping to zero crossings. So when I go to trim, if I'm not at a 0 crossing, when I let go, the program will go or and it'll move my end of my clip where I'm trying to place it. It'll move it just a little bit to the left or right so it hits one of the 0 crossings, and that way it eliminates that annoying click. Let's see if we can do that. Snapping enabled. Okay, I have all these things turned on, which I'm going to turn off. See how right now snap to 0 crossings is there, but it's grayed out? That's probably because I have all these other things turned on. Okay, so now everything is turned off. Maybe I have to enable it. Still not highlighted. Oh, look, here's a 0 crossings. And that doesn't let me do snapping to 0 crossings either. Okay, I'm not sure why. I haven't dealt with that recently in this editor. We'll come back to that. In the meantime, if I drop the volume to 0, then it shouldn't matter that I'm not at 0 crossings, because what happens is the click that you hear when you're not at a 0 crossing is dependent upon how loud your volume is when the clip ends. So if my volume is very loud when I stop and I'm not at a 0 crossing, my click is going to be very loud. If I'm down at 0 volume, so you can't hear anything anyway, that click is still there, but it's impossible to hear. Okay, let's keep editing. You can kind of see too where I'm just visually lining stuff up here. Let's cut that out entirely. Okay, that note doesn't sound quite right. Oops. I'm going to double back. I think I've got my double razor turned on. Yes, I do. There's two different razors. The R tool just slices the clip that you're in, and if you hit R a second time, you get this double razor, and it slices the same part of every track, and that's not something I want. Let's try this again. Okay, so that note there at 33.2, I'm going to write that down because I have to come back to that. That's a bad note, and we can fix that. See, you heard I hit two notes by mistake at once. But I haven't played that note yet in the song. So once I see it again later in the song, we'll cut and paste and we'll fix. Those are very badly timed. I'm not sure where that has to go. Let me think about that. Sorry, I keep hitting C there because it's the command I'm used to in other software. Now you'll notice I've been trying to trim edges of the clips so they don't overlap. I don't necessarily have to do that. Watch what happens if I try overlapping something. We'll zoom in a little bit. And you can see I've already done it. If I move this to the... Oops. There we go. If I move this clip to the right, there's no weird yellow bars up and down vertically. As soon as I hit that, you see something weird happening, and it becomes more obvious as you move it. Basically, it's a weird cross-cut automation, and so if you have two clips over top of each other, it will fade one out and fade the other in at the same time for you. And that's good, because that helps with dealing with the zero crossings automation. So maybe I'm going to do a little less trimming from now on, now that you understand why. And we'll just let... yeah, let's see what happens. Okay, that's pretty good. Okay, that was just a tiny bit too early. Okay, that's a problem. That was too quick. Hard to tell where those two notes, you know, to try and separate them, very tricky. Okay, that's better, although it's unfortunate that we've got that to work with. Now, I don't know why, but I have been doing that with the piano turned off, which makes it hard to tell. You know, I've been doing everything visually, which is good because usually you can, but I probably should have been checking that against the piano. So let's just play back what we've done so far. You can hear the clicks there. Okay, now this is something to know. You can also get the zero crossing problem at the start of a clip. I haven't really been paying much attention to that, but... If I click with my move tool too high in the track, it takes me into a into waveform view. So that's what I'm trying to always hit down here in the low part of the track. Okay, so I've gone through the first verse, and you can see it's a bit of a time-consuming process. I'm not going to subject you to the entire editing of the bass line here, because that'll take quite a while. Hopefully you see what I've done so far. Remember at 33, we had that bad note. Let's see if we can fix that. Let's see, that would be, if that's at 33, and the start is at 15, so it's 18 seconds into the verse, so it's probably around 23. Yep, there it is right there. Okay, so right there is the note that I want. Now I can do one of two things. I believe I can highlight, Control C. No. Okay, so let's do it this way. We'll razor that note, and that way that's its own clip. And I will copy the clip, Control C would have done that, and we'll go back. That's the note that didn't work, so we'll take that out, and we will Control V, paste. Aha! That sounds a lot cleaner. Now we just have to line it up so it's at the right time. Control S for save. Okay, so now I've edited a verse and I fixed a note, so you've got some idea of the concepts. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the cameras off right now, and I will take the next half hour, I'll go through the entire bass track, finish editing it the same way that I've just been doing now, and I will also fix all my little breakpoints, like my fade-ins and fade-outs. You can see here I've got fade-outs on a bunch of stuff, but I don't have fade-ins. I'll zoom in very carefully, I'll fix the whole thing, and then I'll turn the cameras back on and we'll see what I've got accomplished.